Humanity are the Reclaimers, and the rightful heirs to the Mantle of Responsibility, as passed down by the Forerunners. The Precursors themselves tested Forerunners to see if they were worthy of holding the mantle, and decided they ultimately weren't, but then set upon humanity, and decided that humanity would be tested, and they would inevitably become the successors to the Precursors' Mantle of Responsibility. But that may yet again be a construct of control and manipulation. It may not be true at all. I've spoken relatively recently about the possibility that the Xalanyn, otherwise known as the Endless, as introduced in Halo Infinite, could indeed be the inheritors of the Mantle of Responsibility for this galaxy, and that the Forerunners had been lying about that reality all of this time. You'll find a link to that video in the description below. But the more I've mused on that turn of events, the more I've thought about the Endless, the Xalanyn, and exactly what their motivations are and what their supposed truth is, the more I've dug a little deeper into the lore and looked at some of the peripheral lore that surrounds a lot of the events that foretold that humanity would be the Reclaimers versus the new contested lore that the Endless could possibly be the Reclaimers. And the more I looked, the more I found. In fact, there's one glaringly obvious inconsistency, a break in logic, which actually might be the smoking gun to prove that the Endless are supposed to be the Reclaimers, the Endless are supposed to be the holders of the mantle, and that humanity's stake and claim to the Mantle of Responsibility and as the Reclaimers is nothing more than a forced lie and manipulation of the Forerunners. So let's look into it. Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00, and going forward, every single time that I do a most detailed breakdown, for a limited time only, I will make custom apparel that's relevant to that respective most detailed breakdown available to you guys over at my Teespring store. And that starts with the next most detailed breakdown of the Longsword, which will feature this merch. That will be available soon. Now, with all of that said, let's get back to the subject of this video and discuss the break-in logic as to why perhaps humans aren't meant to be the holders of the mantle. The long-standing lore of the Halo universe stipulates that humanity are now the heirs of the Forerunners and to be the holders of the Mantle of Responsibility. Now, the Forerunners once held the Mantle of Responsibility, and they forcibly took the Mantle of Responsibility from the Precursors before them. Now, the implication was that the Forerunners were to be tested to see if they are worthy of holding the Mantle of Responsibility by the Precursors, and were found wanting, and as a consequence they were passed over, and humanity was selected to be the heirs to the mantle instead. Now, the details regarding exactly what happened thereafter, as I've covered in my previous video on the Precursors, which is linked in the description down below and the card at the top right, are vague to say the least. But the narrative in which we've been fully established with over all of these years is that the Forerunners were the holders of the mantle, and when they finally fired the Halo arrays, wiping the galaxy clean of all sentient life in the face of the implacable parasite, humanity were to be the Reclaimers, the ones who would come after and reclaim all Forerunner creations thereafter and become the new holders of the Mantle of Responsibility. Now, it was suggested that the Precursors had made this decision. This was said as much by the Primordial, saying that humanity were to be their successors. But you have to bear in mind that the Primordial was the last Precursor and the first Gravemind at the same time, and the Flood are not averse to manipulating species they view as lesser here in the galaxy, with particular emphasis on the Forerunners. So whether or not the Precursors actually intended for humanity to be the holders of the mantle is subject to debate. But what we do know for absolute certain is that the Forerunners viewed humanity as the Reclaimers. We are something of a sibling species to the Forerunners, but were most definitely under the wing, so to speak, of the Forerunners around 100,000 years ago. That's why humans are identified as reclaimers by many of the ancilla that still run installations of Forerunner design. That's why humans alone find it easy and intuitive to access Forerunner systems, whereby it will lock out other sentient species such as the elites or the prophets. So one thing we know for absolute certain is that the Forerunners fully intended humanity to be their heirs. But right there is where we find our issue. There is a break in logic, so bear with me while I talk this through. There are some inconsistencies surrounding the particulars of this part of the Halo lore and the story of the Precursors and the Forerunners, but basically what seems to be the implication is that the Precursors seeded life in the galaxy, the Forerunners became one of the most advanced of those species, and one way or another, the Forerunners were assessed as to whether or not they were worthy of holding the mantle of responsibility as interpreted by the Precursors, and were ultimately found wanting. Thereafter, one of two things happened. The first being that the Precursors disliked the Forerunners' interpretation of the mantle and decided to wipe them out and instead select humanity to be the holders of the mantle, which the Forerunners found out about and then preemptively struck back at their creators to avoid their own extinction. Or the Forerunners were fully aware that they were being tested, disliked the fact that they failed the test, and disliked the fact that humanity would be selected, and then fought back in kind of a revenge strike. It's one or the other. That's the main scheme that we're getting from the narrative. But one thing that's consistent in both of those stories is that humanity are to become the holders of the mantle. But I can't be the only one that finds it a little bit peculiar that the Forerunners would decide to have humanity as their heirs when they went to war with the Precursors in the first place because they didn't want humanity to be their heirs. In fact, the more I think about it just now, the only difference between these two cases is that in the first case, humanity are the heirs to the Precursors, and in the second, humanity are the heirs to the Forerunners. So the only difference in those two is that the Forerunners had a degree of control and influence in the second one, more so than in the first. I mean, let's be honest, it doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it. The Precursors chose humanity to be the holders of the mantle. The Forerunners didn't like that and went to war and exterminated their creators. Then once the Flood arrived in the galaxy and the Forerunners realised their backs were against the wall and they couldn't do anything about it, they ultimately decided to sterilise the galaxy and allow the very species that the Precursors chose to be the holders of the mantle in the first place be the holders of the mantle in their absence. Why select the very species that you destroyed your creators in the first place because they chose that species to be the species to hold the mantle? I mean, in its simplest terms, from a human-centric point of view, this would be pretty much in line with the idea of a son killing his father because he said that his grandchild would be the inheritor of everything he left behind, when ultimately when the son dies, everything passes to the grandchild anyway. That might not have made a massive amount of sense, but you've got to bear in mind that humanity 100,000 years ago had been devolved by the Forerunners, so we were something of a child to them, so to speak. Before we weren't, we were more evolved. Ancient humanity were much more sophisticated than the humanity that we were 100,000 years ago. In fact, the ancient humanity that were more advanced could be considered a sibling species to the Forerunners. But once the Forerunners had manipulation over our genome and devolved us to the point that they did, we somewhat became their children. Hence the quote from 343 Guilty Spark, "You are the child of my makers." And the quote from the Gravemind, "Child of my enemy, why have you come?" But surely I can't be alone here. And if you agree, or disagree, I'd love to hear in the comments. It doesn't make sense that the Forerunners would hunt the Precursors to extinction because they chose humanity to be their heirs, when ultimately they sacrificed themselves and left humanity as the heirs anyway. But if that ultimately is how this series of events went down, then that leaves us with one sombering reality. Humanity were never meant to be the holders of the mantle. We were made the holders of the mantle because the Forerunners stole the mantle of responsibility from the Precursors in the first instance, and we were a species they could control. And that leaves us with the Xalanyn, the Harbinger currently being the only individual that we've actually seen firsthand who just so happens to bear the Reclaimer symbol on the crest of her helmet, leaving the distinct possibility that the Precursors intended the Xalanyn to be the holders of the mantle. And because the Forerunners didn't know much about them, this was an unknown variable that they couldn't account for, and ultimately decided to strike out with immense force to seize control of a situation that was rapidly spiralling outside of their control. Then ultimately, when they were confronted with the Flood, which they likened to be basically their creator's final revenge against them, the only decision they had left was to make a species they knew they could control, they knew that they could influence, the holders of the mantle in their stead. And thus, the lie of humanity's reclamation was born. And even now, as I think even more about it, perhaps what we know about the Precursors isn't accurate at all. Perhaps they really are the Lovecraftian, horrific species that I'd hypothesized in my video about the true nature of the Flood. Again, linked below. Maybe the true reality of what the Flood and what the Precursors really are was genuinely so horrific that the humans of that era that asked those questions committed suicide because it was a better alternative. Maybe the Precursors really are the big enemy in this, and in that case, like I said before, we were devolved by the Forerunners as punishment. We were effectively brothers. Humans and Forerunners were siblings. We were both created by the Precursors. We were both equal footing, technologically speaking. So in that regard, maybe even to this day, the Forerunners are just our big brothers. And they're looking out for us, they're protecting us. They're providing us with the tools and weapons and technology that we need to fight off the Precursors and perhaps the Endless, and without any doubt, the Flood, in their absence. Perhaps this story isn't all doom and gloom. Maybe we need to be looking upon the Forerunners as brothers. Maybe we need to be looking upon the Flood, the Precursors and the Xalanyn as the real threat. We don't know half of what we think we know, and half of that is wrong. It's time to question just what is truth and what is lie in our interpretation of the histories of the Halo universe. Because something isn't adding up here, and coming to the wrong conclusion really is a matter of life and death.